You're listening to the Vint Podcast, where we bring you interviews and stories from around the world of wine and spirits. From winemakers and critics to sommeliers and master distillers, we'll explore the people and businesses who are instrumental in shaping the future of today's food and drinks culture. Enjoy the show. Hey everyone, welcome back to another episode of the Vint Podcast. My name is Brady, joined back in studio by Billy Galanko, who's fresh off a workout, it looks like. Not because you're sweaty, but because you're fit. Trim.
Yeah, here it's a mess. But no, it's a workout in that I've been working out a way to get our guest that we have on our podcast today on the podcast for the past, basically the whole existence of our podcast for the past 2 years. So I'm really excited to have our guest on today.
Yeah, we don't want to bury the lead. José Vouillamoz, who is a wine or a grape geneticist. I always say like a wine
one
grape
of the foremost
geneticist.
grape geneticists. Yeah.
That's right. Yeah, not just but the foremost. And conversation that we don't often get to have with folks in that kind of detail. We've talked about clones maybe once or twice on the podcast, but a deep dive here today.
Yeah. No, I first came across him when I got the tome, basically Jancis Robinson's wine grapes. It's not Jancis, it's him, José Vouillamoz, Jancis Robinson, and Julia Harding, who we've also had on the podcast, collaborated on this. That has over 1,000 grapes that are used to make wine. So while he makes a great point and people are doing wine and grape genetics, mainly grape genetics throughout the world, he is, in my mind, the foremost just because he's part of this book that's so widely distributed. I own it. It was one of my first intros to some of these obscure rare varieties. And he's also mentioned in one of my other favorite books, Godforsaken Grapes, as well when they're in Switzerland. So super cool. Really excited to have him on. But I will, before we get into a little bit description of the conversation here, I want to mention a couple things from this weekend. We were tasting at various places, and you would be proud of me. We had a wine from Virginia this weekend. So that was exciting.
Do you remember the producer and such?
I remember it was from the Shenandoah Valley, and I remember that it was an orange wine. And I will tell you exactly who it is. It was Lightwell Survey.
Oh, nice. It was an orange, was it? Oh, yeah. Did you see the bottle?
Yes, I have it here. We bought the bottle.
A sunset on the front?
Yeah. Oh, here. I have a picture of me turning it. No, it has like a red and white thing. I didn't really take a picture of the label part of it. I took a label of the name and the varieties. It had the Vidal Blanc, Noret, Traminette, Chambourcin, and our favorite Petit Manseng. Nice, I only said the joke about 4 times.
Yeah, they're one of my favorite producers down there. They have a couple of rosés that feature those varieties too, like blended rosés, right? Which are super good. And they do some, I can't remember if they're co-ferments or they're like blended, but like apple wine, I believe, with grapes.
The name sounded, I knew the name sounded familiar because of your pontificating. So I was like, guys, we got to get it. And people didn't really want it. And then when my fiance found out it was actually from Virginia, she thought I was kidding. She was like, no, we definitely can't get it. So I was like, no, we're gonna get it. I swear it's gonna be good. And everybody liked it. So
yeah,
and then
I think one of their cool labels that they have, it's called Elon Musk, I believe, is what they call it, and it has like a picture of him on the front with a rocket ship. And I think it's Petit Manseng. I could be totally butchering that, but it's like a collector bottle, maybe, if that's the case.
Nice. I'll have to find that. And then in the same sitting, we also had the Scythian's White by Raj Par. So that's the Palomino that he actually gets from Rancho Cucamonga. So that, like ancient Palomino, and then that he ferments in the sherry barrels that he brings back from Jerez. Cool. So that was super cool. Yeah, it's a nice time. But
that was right up my alley this weekend. Virginia wines, Raj Par wines, man.
I know. I thought about you the whole time, and then we had the other one we had there was a Mencia at the end that kind of tasted weirdly herbaceous, so that was kind of strange. But nice. Yeah, it was a great little sitting. But so getting back to José Vouillamoz, I guess we cover a wide range of topics in here. I'd be actually interested ahead of the interview to actually get your thoughts on what you like the most. I think it was really interesting. He talked about a couple of varieties and their parents that I actually didn't know or haven't read in a while. So I thought that was personally the most interesting part for me.
Yeah, from, know if I'm going to articulate this well or not, but I was initially surprised that there was so much commonality between different varieties, right? It seemed so many grapes that I thought were just totally different from one another actually came back, like you said, to the same parents or similar parents.
Mhm.
And also at the same time, the conversation gives the air that there's just extravagant difference between all these things. Like there's so much out there, basically, right? And so, I think this book, the Wine Grapes book, you mentioned it, there's 1,368 different varieties mentioned in it. And I know based on this conversation, that's only, hardly scratching the surface of what they imagine is out there, right? And yeah, I think it's a worthwhile conversation to tune into, even if 50% of it maybe is too in the weeds or goes over your head, which it did for me in certain ways because I'm just not as familiar with, so many of these tertiary varieties. But it left me feeling both of those things, that the wine world is fairly simple, but also like extremely broad and complex.
Yeah. There was a couple wine podcasts that I used to listen to when I first started listening to wine, and I listened to it once and I was like, wow, that's fascinating. And then as I studied, I kept listening to it. And every time I listened to it, I learned more or understood more. So I feel like this is one of those conversations where I actually am going, like, listening back to some of the things he said, because there's just so much in there that he packs. But I completely agree. It really makes you think of, we even talk about like Brunello di Montalcino, like that is Sangiovese, but it's just grown in a certain area, and they pick, a clone of it, or not a clone of it is, Sangiovese grew a certain way. They like the way that grew, so they kept growing it, and that's now a thing, but it's still Sangiovese, which is super neat. And just all of those little nuances.
That's one of the challenging things I think about, like for someone who, like me, who knows just enough to be a little bit dangerous, but not really, that much. It's one of the things that's challenging about this conversation was you think about varieties grown in different parts of the world or made in different styles, and you're like, it can be totally different. And so that adds another layer of complexity to identifying, this grape is related to this other grape. And it's okay, genetically they're related, but you can make it in one style there and another style here, and they're totally different. So does this even matter? Just a huge mind, put your mind in a blender sort of conversation, but one that you have to emerge respecting both the wine trade and like the legacy and history of wine, of producers and growers, as well as the work that Jose and, many others are doing to identify and bring these stories to life. I think you have to respect that at the end of the day.
For sure. Yeah. And I still think it goes back to, it really makes you also appreciate the typicity of certain regions. For a wine to say it's kind of a distinctly a certain style, it really gives you a sense of terroir, just because there is so much variation and change that's possible to create a consistently a wine with a sense of place, I think is really impressive. All right. Without further ado, here is our interview with world famous grape geneticist, José Vouillamoz. All right. We are here with a very special guest, José Vouillamoz. Thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you for having me.
Yeah, as we would have mentioned in the intro, Jose is one of my longtime guests I've wanted to have on the podcast ever since reading Godforsaken Grapes and also the Wine Grapes book. I'm so excited to pick your brain, hear what you've been working on lately, and really get into the wine genetics and your botany background. But could you provide the listeners with a little background from the horse's mouth about what you've done throughout your career?
Yes, I will try to be brief on the subject.
Yeah, I know it's a lot.
I've always been interested in biology, in plants, in animals. As a child, I was bringing back small animals, small plants at home and study them. So I studied biology, especially botany and plant physiology. Then I made a Ph.D. in plant genetics. So I was not working on grapes. I was working on a special plant with a bizarre genetics, bizarre chromosomes. So I needed to apply all these DNA techniques to study this plant and classification. And at the same time, I was becoming more and more of a wine lover. I was taking classes, I was organizing tastings and doing everything I could to learn more about grapes and wines. And doing this technique for a group of plants, I thought to myself, why don't we do the same for grapes? So I looked up on the internet. It was at the end of the 90s. So I did my PhD at the end of the 90s. And I saw that some people had already this idea before me. So the first ones who had already used DNA profiling on grape varieties were in Australia in 93 and 94. They published the first papers. And then in 97, UC Davis with Carol Meredith and John Bowers published a fantastic paper revealing the parentage of Cabernet Sauvignon, which is a natural child of Cabernet Franc and Sauvignon Blanc. And I thought that was fascinating. I looked around me in Switzerland and no one had ever done that in Switzerland. After my PhD, I applied for a grant to the government and I got a grant to spend 1 year in California in the lab of Carol Meredith at UC Davis to learn the technique of DNA profiling on Swiss grapes. So I brought in my luggage, I brought a small box in which I had small tubes with the dry DNA of everything that was living as grapes in Switzerland and also the surrounding countries. And I spent 1 year studying my Swiss grapes in California. That's how it started.
Awesome. Can you share with our listeners a few varieties that may be considered Swiss grapes? Because I don't think many people are familiar with that.
Oh yeah. When I was at the lab at UC Davis, it was funny because few people knew where Switzerland was. First of all, they confused with Sweden, which is quite common. And then nobody knew that we are making wine in Switzerland. We make very good wines, but the export is less than 1%. So if you don't travel to Switzerland, usually you don't come across Swiss wines abroad. And on top of it, we have 21 indigenous grape varieties that nobody knows of. For example, in white, the most famous is called Arbin or Petit Arbin, aromatic, high in acidity, very nice grape. And in reds, we have, for example, Cornalin, which is also a very good alpine grape variety. So I was working on these varieties and I could find the natural parents of one of them, at least one of them, which is Cornalin. So I was able to identify its natural parents, which are both from Aosta Valley. So Switzerland is in the middle of Europe and it's at the border with Italy. And across the border, we have Aosta Valley. And where I live is called Valley. So they're very similar. And the parents come from the other side of the mountains, which was a very nice discovery. The parents are called Petit Rouge, which means small red. And the other one is Mayolet, obscure varieties that you can find only in this place on the planet. So it's the only place in Italy where you find this variety. So that was fascinating, but I could not share it with anyone because nobody knew them. So when I got back to Switzerland, I was able to give talks and conferences and write in newspaper and scientific papers to announce this news. And then I made a few other discoveries on other grapes from Switzerland or other countries.
What was the level of interest when you started that work with identifying the natural parents of different varieties, just out in the academy and in the winemaking, among producers? Because it seems that interest in wine genetics has certainly grown recently and people wanting to understand that. What was it like when you first started that work?
People were very much interested in it. At first, for the general public, for some people, when you pronounce the word DNA, they are afraid of it. And they instantly think of GMOs, which has nothing to do. What I was doing and what I'm still doing is to analyze, to observe the genetic composition with DNA profiling. We don't modify anything. So that was the first step I had to explain to people. Don't be afraid. We don't modify your grapes. but then they were really interested in it because it was quite new to the wine world. Before DNA profiling, we could make some hypotheses. Maybe this grape is related to this one because the shape of the leaves is similar, the taste but this is ampelography, very important research based on the description, the morphology of the leaves, of the berries, of the grapes, the bunches, etc. But this was not enough to be able to identify the parents. So when we came up with DNA profiling, that was a big surprise. And for example, when I found the parents of Cornalin, I remember that the Swiss people were at first disappointed of it. Why disappointed? Because I was telling them the red grape that you love so much comes from Italy, from the other side of the mountain. And many of them told me, it gives me belly aches when I learned that my beloved Clonal is not Swiss, it's Italian. And then I said, come on, if you look at history, this part of Switzerland belongs to Switzerland only since 1815. Before that, we were all part of the realm of Savoy. So Aosta, Piemonte, Savoy, and Valais were part of the same political group of regions. So it's absolutely normal to have exchanges from one place to the other. And a few years later, the same people were telling me, thank you very much, because now we have a very nice story to tell about this wine and we sell much more. So that was very good at the end.
Have you had anybody else, now that you've done this for thousands of grapes, have you had anybody else, any other regions get angry at you, or maybe ampelographers who are like, now you're putting me out of a job because they can just figure it out on their own?
I would say yes, especially in Italy, where they are very conservative, and the old ampelography professors would not accept the DNA results because it was against what they have always thought or taught to their students. But then again, if I'm not doing this, somebody else can do the same and end up with the same results. For example, I remember that when I was working in Italy, I was lucky enough to find the natural parents of Sangiovese. One of them is called Cilieggiolo, which means small cherry. It's cultivated in Tuscany. It's accepted in Chianti, Classico appellation. So that was not a big surprise. The big surprise was the other parent, which is called Calabrese di Montenuovo, which comes from Calabria, south of Italy. And if you know a little bit of Italy, I hope we don't have too many Italian friends listening to us, but there is a big competition between the north and the south. And Italians from the north consider the south like peasants, lower people. So they were absolutely shocked to learn that Sangiovese, which is the pride of Tuscany, but not only, was half Tuscan, but also half Calabrian. That was a shock for them. But this is ignoring the fact that Sangiovese is not only cultivated historically in Italy, but all over south of Italy. You can find it in Calabria, you can find it on Sicily, you can find it in Puglia, in many different regions of the south. Sangiovese has a very long history over there. So it's not a surprise to learn that it is a child of one grape from Tuscany, one grape from Calabria. So that was a bit of a shock. And some old ampelography professor would pretend that I was wrong and that Sangiovese was domesticated directly from wild grapevines by the Etruscans in Tuscany. We have absolutely no evidence for that.
Even if that was the case, it still needed to be, the two grapes needed to make that grape eventually at some point. So could have been crossing back then. So you didn't run into the same issue maybe in France where, Gouais Blanc is a parent of some of these important grapes or anything else? People were just more accepting?
Yeah, in France, there is also a long history of DNA profiling studies made by my colleagues, especially Jean-Michel Boursicot and then Thierry Lacombe. And they made a huge work on the subject. So I did not work a lot on French varieties, but it was a little bit of competition. For example, UC Davis and Montpellier, the two research centers, have collaborated on the identification of the parents of Syrah. So they were able, I was not involved in the research, they were able to demonstrate that the natural parents of Syrah are, one is Dureza, a red variety from Ardèche, and the other one is Mondeuse Blanche from Savoie. What I did based on this parentage, I tried to expand the family tree. And I was able, it's very complicated, but I was able to, for the first time, to show that most likely Syrah is a grandchild of Pinot. And nobody had ever thought about this possible link between Pinot and Syrah. And it showed that all the varieties for which we have long thought of diverse origins, distant origin, they are, most of them are more or less genetically related. So there are groups of what we called in the book wine grapes. We call them founder varieties. And you mentioned Gouais Blanc. Gouais Blanc is one of them. Pinot is another one. So Gouais Blanc had many, many natural children, more than 82, as we know of today. And Gouais Blanc is a grape that I like very much because the wine may be not so good. We have some Swiss people making it since the Middle Ages continuously. One of the rare people who make wine from Gouais Blanc. It's high in acidity. It's rather delicate in aroma, but it's producing a lot, and the bunches are huge. So if you don't lower the yields, you end up with super acidic wines that are almost impossible to drink. But given this quality of high acidity, it gave birth to varieties like Chardonnay. Chardonnay has the aromatic, but also nice acidity. It's the parent also of Riesling, for example. Very nice acidity. The parent of Food Mint, with which we make Tokai wines. In reds, it's the parent of Blaufränkisch. Also rather nicely acidic grape from Austria, and so on and so on. Gouais Blanc had a huge importance in the development and in the birth of many grape varieties that we cultivate today in Europe.
Well, I have the book. I don't know if I just have looked at all of these in isolation, but those are some of my favorite grapes, like Blaufränkisch, Ferment, and Riesling, just for that acid base. Wow, maybe I should get like a hat that has Gouais Blanc, wrap it more. So how did you come about talking to Jancis and Julia about making a book? Was it something that you proposed, or is it they sought you out as, a leader in the space?
First of all, I did my first postdoc in California, as I said, in the lab of Carol Meredith. Then I moved to Italy doing a second postdoc. Then I was a researcher in Switzerland, and I worked in different parts of the planet. And one day I have received an email from Jancis. Later on, I told her that I thought it was a spam, but it was not. She was contacting me because she was updating the Oxford Companion to Wine. And she asked Professor Carol Meredith if she would agree to update all the entries regarding grape varieties. And Carol Meredith said, I just retired. She retired early because she wanted to make wine with her husband in Napa Valley, which she did until recently. So she said, no, I'm retired. I'm not into this anymore. But there is this Swiss guy who was with me. He's passionate about grapes. He's currently in Italy. You should contact him. So I got an email from Jancis, and I accepted to revise and update all the entries regarding grapes in the Oxford Companion to Wine for free, with pleasure. But then in my head, I had a thought a few years later. So I think that was in 2004 that we did it. And 4 years later, 2008, I contacted Jancis because when I was giving talks and conferences, many people would ask me, that's fascinating, all the stories, parentage of the grapes. Don't you have a website with this information? For free, of course. So I thought there is a matter of writing a book. So I contacted Jancis, and I suggested to write a book about the 15 most important varieties in the world. So I had in mind to work like a few months, 6 months, and become rich and famous. I was returning from a trip, and I stopped in London. So we met in London, and being super smart, Jancis told me, I like your suggestion. We should do something, but we should fill a gap that exists in literature. It's not a book about 15 grapes. It's a book about all the grape varieties that are in existence in the world and that are used to make wine. And I said yes instantly without thinking that my 6 months have become 4 years. So it was 4 years in the making. Yes. It was a huge amount of work, but it was a real pleasure for me to work with these two fantastic ladies, Jancis Robinson and Julia Harding, two masters of wine. Hardworking, clever women, and it's still a pleasure to work with them. We are still in contact regularly.
We had Julia on in the fall, and I've been trying to somehow contact you for years, so we used her to get your email. But she is amazing. So go ahead, Brady.
Absolutely. Yeah.
Yeah, Jancis we've been emailing, but I think she thinks we're spam, like you thought she was spam.
Oh, maybe. Yeah.
That's really cool. So I wanted to go back to some of the founder grape varieties. Can you share, just for our listeners, maybe 2 other of those founder grapes that you were able to identify close parents for?
Oh yeah, one of them is Pinot. Pinot is very important by crossings with, especially with Gouais Blanc. It gave birth, as I said, to Chardonnay. Chardonnay is a child of Gouais Blanc and Pinot, but also to Gamay, for example. Gamay and Chardonnay have the same parents, so they are brothers. They are full siblings, as we can call them. It was also involved in many different parentage. And another important grape variety is Savagnin Blanc, that is called Traminer in Germany. And Savagnin also has a huge importance. It's the parent of Sauvignon Blanc in the Loire, of Chenin Blanc, for example, and many other varieties, as far as Verdejo in Portugal. So it used to be much more widespread than it is today, and it had a huge influence. In total, I don't have the list in my mind, but in total we have identified 13 founder grape varieties in Europe. For example, another example is Cayetana Blanca in Portugal, which is rather unknown to the people, but it had many different children that are currently cultivated either in Spain or in Portugal. And we had identified these 13 founder varieties, saying that there must be many more than that. I think there are founder varieties, for example, in Georgia, in Armenia, in Turkey, in Greece, but the research on the parentages of all these grapes has not been done yet. So there would still be a huge amount of work to be done in these countries. I have helped also to identify the grape varieties. We have used DNA profiling. I was the first one to make DNA profiling on grapes from Turkey, from Armenia and Georgia in 2006. So we have the database, we have all the DNA profiles, which is one thing. We can speak about how we do DNA profiling very, very simply. If you want me to make a parenthesis on that, to identify a grape with DNA profiling, we focus on a few specific regions of the DNA that have been identified on different groups of plants. And for each species, in this case, Vitis vinifera, for each species, we have identified these regions that are differing from one variety to the other, but staying the same for the variety. So you look at the different regions of the DNA, usually 8, 10, I do 12 different regions. When I say look at it, we use small pieces of DNA and we bind them to the region that we want to observe. And then we use PCR. Thanks to COVID-19, everybody knows about PCR today. So it's working exactly the same. So you tell the PCR system, which is an enzyme, you tell between these two spots, you amplify everything that is in between. So you amplify it to the billions, and then you stain it, or you can visualize it in a machine. And this gives you a length, which is the number of bases of DNA, molecules of DNA in between these two spots. So you have a number, let's say 212, for example. And since every grape, like every human being, has chromosomes going by pairs, when you look at one region, you can have two different values on the chromosomes. So the regions are the same, but you can have different values because one chromosome comes from the father, the other chromosome comes from the mother. So you have two values, then you go to somewhere else in the DNA, another two values, etc., etc. Then you have a table with columns, every two values, and you check them against the database. The larger the database, the better the results. So in my case, I have today more than 3,000 different DNA profiles in my database. So if you give me a vine, usually a vine leaf, a small leaf, that's enough. I will dry it. I will make a powder, then extract the DNA, then look at these regions, get the numbers, check in my database, and I will be able to tell you this is Barbera. Or if you gave me something saying it's Chardonnay, I can tell you, no, it's not Chardonnay. It's something else. You should plant something else in your vineyard. So that's how it's working. So this is to identify a grape variety. When you want to understand the family tree, when you want to study the parentage, you use the same technique, but instead of looking at 12 different regions, you look at 50 different regions, which is more expensive and much more time consuming. So that's why it has been done in countries like Italy. I did it in Switzerland. My colleagues did it in France, Germany. But in countries like I said before, Greece, Turkey, all the Eastern countries, they have not done that yet. And I would be super excited to do that for them.
Can you? Yeah, you actually have me thinking, because I'm sure we'd actually learn a lot of even parents of some of the grapes we think maybe your founder grapes, even, who knows. But can you explain a little bit about the difference between when you're going through and you're finding parents or unique traits and you're finding a unique variety versus something like Pinot? Just going back to that, many people think Pinot Noir, Pinot Gris, like Pinot Grigio, or not Pinot Grigio, Pinot Blanc are, their own variety, but in fact, they're all genetically the same. Can you explain the difference between a new variety versus something that has expressed traits, but the same DNA as a different variety or the same variety?
I don't like when I hear people speaking about the Pinot family or the Traminer family or Savagnin family with all these colors, because Pinot Noir, Pinot Gris, Pinot Blanc, and also Pinot Meunier are only mutations of one and the same variety that I call simply Pinot. It happened that Pinot Noir had small accidents, and with genetic accidents called mutations, it changed color. So it once went from Pinot Noir to Pinot Blanc, and once from Pinot Gris to Pinot Blanc. And we have also observed recently a Pinot Gris becoming Pinot Blanc. So it's quite common in the vineyards. In Burgundy, many wine producers observe that. On the vine, you can have the whole vine with red berries and one shoot that is bearing white berries. And if people think or consider that there are different varieties, I have a fantastic set of pictures of bunches in which you have one part of the bunch that is white and one part that is red. So can you explain to me how you can have two different varieties in the same bunch? It's impossible. So it's only a mutation. And people think that they are distinct varieties because the color is different and because they taste different. But then, as you said, we need to ask ourselves, when can we speak about a new variety or not? The answer is simple. To have a new variety, you need to go through plant sexuality. You need to have the pollen of a mother plant going on the pistil of another plant. And you need to have the berry developing with grape pips, and the pips contain the embryos of the next generation of the children. It's the only way that you can create, either naturally in the vineyards or in laboratory, you create a new variety. All the rest is only clonal differences. And I'm really, really strong on that, because if for some people, Pinot Blanc is very different from Pinot Noir, for a biochemist, Pinot Noir clone 115 is completely different from Pinot Noir clone 777, which tastes also very different. So where do you put the limit? For someone, maybe the color is important. For another one, the flavors. For another one, the maturity. So these are only clonal differences. If you want to have a new variety, you need to go through crossings.
That's fascinating. It almost, that level of information starts to undermine a lot of the ways that we talk about, our varieties, and tell stories of the wines. And so I could see the industry not wanting to go too deep into that rabbit hole, because it creates such a muddied story, although a fascinating story, but a muddied story about how many of these wines that we love came to be. It makes me think about wanting you to share, what are some of the dominant and recessive traits of these grapes? For instance, if, is it common to see certain characteristics continuously carried forward in a family tree? For instance, acidity or color or some kind of resistance to disease? Are any of these characteristics more common to be carried forward versus to end in a lineage? It seems that color,
changes all the time and can be passed from parent to child differently? How does that work?
The color question is more complicated than that, but
We go as far as
without speaking about the color, we must understand that the grapes, the grape variety, the Varieties vinifera, is what we call highly heterogeneous. The heterozygosity is very high. That means that the two sets of chromosomes are very different. For example, if you take wheat, you can propagate wheat by seeds because the seeds are the new generation. But the homozygosity of wheat makes it that 99% of the chromosomes are almost identical. So if you multiply with seeds, you don't see the difference. If you do it with grape varieties, if you plant a grape pip, what you will get is the child of the grape variety that will be very different from the mother because of this heterozygosity. So because of the big differences between the two sets of chromosomes. That said, it's very interesting to know the parentages of grape varieties, especially if you want to follow the heritability of the traits. So you were speaking about acidity. Usually we search for resistance to diseases, to powdery mildew, downy mildew, and to drought and frost. So when you understand the genealogy of a grape variety, you can better understand how the resistance genes are transmitted from one generation to the other.
Do you see differences in the way that manifests in different parts of the world, or is that consistent across, Vinous vinifera?
It's quite consistent across Varieties vinifera. Another thing that I don't like to hear is that Pinot is more prone to mutations than other varieties, which is wrong. That there's no point for Pinot to be more prone to mutations than any other variety. The difference is that Pinot is much older than many other varieties. It's been around for at least 1,000 years, probably 2,000 years. It has been cultivated continuously. It has been multiplied vegetatively. So when you take cuttings, if you want to plant a new Pinot vineyard, you go to the nurseryman and you order cuttings. So these are clones of the same plant. These are multiplications of the same plant. And when you do that, some accidents happen, which are called mutations. And when they accumulate, you have a huge amount of genetic diversity within the grape variety. You have a lot of clonal differences between the plants, which is the case for Pinot. So if you look at different clones of Pinot, the differences are really observable by the human eye. If you take a more recent variety, for example, Müller-Thurgau. Müller-Thurgau was created in a research center in 1882, so almost 150 years. But still, if you look at the vineyard, all the plants look very, very similar. It did not have time to accumulate all the genetic diversity that you can observe in Pinot, you can observe in Savagnin, you can observe also in Sangiovese, that is very old. Nebbiolo as well, in Piemonte, very, very old. So the old varieties have a huge genetic diversity, which for me is very important to maintain and conserve, because this genetic diversity will be one of the solutions to cope with climate change in the future. Because all these clones have been developed over the centuries. Many of them have already gone through different climates. So if you keep the diversity that exists in the vineyard, you are stronger against the future climate.
So many different clones of a given variety. How many are actually being planted of, just say Pinot Noir around the world? And, it seems that you're speaking of it in such a way that the clonal differences probably make up a larger amount of the distinctions that we typically draw between Pinot Noir planted in the States versus in France or in another part of the world. How much does that impact the expression of the variety, in a wine?
For Pinot Noir or for Pinot, we estimate at 1,000 different clones have been identified. Around 1,000. Of course, they are not all planted and distributed all over the world. I think in France, 18 of them are officially authorized by the regulation. But many people go back to what we call massal selection. So we've been through clonal selection for many years, since the 50s and the 60s, which was basically to identify in a vineyard, to identify which one was the best or which two plants were the best. And you focus on them and you multiply only these two, mostly for higher yields back then. By doing so, you lower a lot the genetic diversity in the vineyard, because you have only 2 or 3 clones that have been distributed. For example, for Syrah, only 2 or 3 clones have long been distributed. And then if you have a changing climate or you have a new disease and it happens that these clones are very sensitive, you lose all of it and you need to fight against it. Whereas if you maintain the diversity, if you have, let's say, dozens or hundreds of different clones in your vineyard, then you will be less subject to problems with pathogens and the environment, with frost and drought and all the biotic and abiotic stresses that you can have. So the problem is to maintain this diversity. A new technique that I'm not using, but I'm reading a lot about, is whole genome sequencing to identify the clones. So I started using DNA profiling in the late 90s. And back then we were dreaming of being able to not only identify a grape variety with DNA profiling, but also identify the clones. And we have long not been able to do this, because the technique that we use, we call them microsatellites, the name of the DNA technique that we use to identify. This does not allow to identify the clones. But today, it is possible to make whole genome sequencing, basically to read all the DNA of the plant from beginning to the end, which has been done first on Pinot in 2007. Again, I was not part of the project, but it was in the same lab that I was in Italy. My colleagues were doing it. 2007, they have published the full genome of Pinot, and the cost was 23 million euros for the project. So a few years later, less than 10 years later, the same colleagues said, if you want to do it now, it's 100,000 euros.
Oh, wow.
And a few years later, the same guys told me, today is $500 for the same. So for $500, you can have the whole DNA genome of a plant. So they have started to do so, to use it with the clones. And the first paper was published in 2018. So it's rather recent. Italian colleagues who have identified 98 different clones of Nebbiolo. It was the first time that we could identify the clones with genetic markers and with DNA. I know that today many people are studying Chardonnay, I think in South Africa. Sauvignon Blanc is being studied in New Zealand. A lot of projects are going on, but it's rather recent. But it's fascinating because we will be able to understand the clonal differences from a genetic point of view. We can identify the clones. We can also understand why a clone is more aromatic or ripens early or whatever other trait. It will be fascinating in the future to understand better the clonal differences.
Yeah. On that note, so before the question I was trying to ask, and I think it's actually even more poignant here, is that have you seen actually learning more that these are all different clones, especially for Nebbiolo, for example, that maybe that is part of the expression of quote unquote terroir in a vineyard? Like I'm thinking of some of these older varieties that have maybe grown in the same spot and everybody's, this place grows the best. I know, Brunello has identified the Brunello, offshoot of Sangiovese for a long time. But do you think that's also maybe the case in like certain places in Piemonte or Burgundy or places that have grown the same variety for a really long time?
Yeah, in the case of Brunello is Sangiovese. Not only an offshoot, it is Sangiovese.
Well, that's what I'm saying, but that clone was identified. Yeah.
When you have a group of clones that share a similar morphology like Brunello, which have larger and rounder berries, we tend to call them biotypes. Biotypes are groups of different clones that share a similar morphology or a similar trait. So let's call them biotypes. They have been developed over the years. In this case, absolutely right. It's locally that it has been developed and it did not travel much. So you can have the terroir effect on these groups of clones called biotypes. But in my opinion, terroir is really exemplified best when you have a diversity of different clones. It's a big question. It's another topic about terroir.
That makes sense.
But I think the clonal diversity is very, very important. If you only select one clone and you plant it next to Romanée Conti, you will never get a wine as good as Romanée Conti because they have been doing Massal selection forever. They have never stopped. I was talking to Oprah Villette, who was showing me how they continuously do Massal selections, not only for Romanée Conti, but all the wines of DRC domain, Romanée Conti. So it's very important to maintain this diversity, and many wine growers go back to Massal selections.
All right. When this is just a nerdy viticulture question, when they're doing that, say for DRC, they're still grafting, right? Are they picking different rootstocks because they're not planting on their own roots? How are they selecting those?
If I'm not mistaken, at Romanée Conti, they have waited until 1945 to graft their vineyard. So it was rather late because Phylloxera first appeared in France, in southern France, in the Gard region in 1863. So they waited a long time in Romanée Conti before pulling it out and replanting with grafted vines. I don't know the details of the rootstock that they are using at DRC, but what I know and what I'm always suggesting people to do, especially in order to face climate change, is to work on the rootstocks for every region. Usually we hear that it's important to match the right variety to the right terroir. But this is too simple. It's simplistic. You need to match the right clones on the right rootstocks on the right terroir. So the combinations are huge, but we need to go through this work because in many regions, okay, we know that the rootstock 3309 Couder, it's working well on limestone. Okay, everybody plants on this rootstock without seeking further or researching further if maybe another rootstock would be better for your specific needs in your terroir. There is still a huge amount of work to be done. It's time consuming. It will cost a lot of money, but I think it is one of the best solutions that we will be able to find against climate change. I cannot think of, we spoke about Romanée Conti, I cannot think of Romanée Conti being planted with anything else than Pinot. So for some regions, okay, we can have new hybrids, resistant hybrids that you can plant, which is good for the environment because you need less treatments. But for famous regions with terroir, we will want to keep Nebbiolo in Barolo. We will want to keep Pinot in Burgundy. We will want to keep Formint in Tokai, and so on and so on. So working on the rootstocks for me is a key for the future.
Awesome. Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. That's something I've been thinking about as I'm going back through my viticultural studies and prep for applying to the MW. So I have one more question. I know we're getting close to time. So in an example like Carmenere, have you had winemakers or viticulturalists come to you and say due to your work or similar genetics, the quality of my winemaking or the approach I'm taking to my winemaking or growing has dramatically improved or changed?
Yeah, there are some stories. So first of all, we saved some money for various wine growers, especially when I was in California. I remember one wine grower who wanted us to check if what the nursery sent him as Syrah was really Syrah. Because when you receive from the nursery, the plant is not fully developed. You have small leaves, so it's difficult to identify. So we did the DNA profiling, and he was about to plant, I think, 100 hectares. And we told him, stop it right now. It's not Syrah. It's something else. So you will lose money because it's not what you want. So that was a good part of it. For a few, DNA profiling of one plant is around $200-$300. So with $300, you saved a lot of money by not planting the wrong variety. Also, by identifying the parents of grape varieties, I've always told everyone, but nobody listens to me. I've always told everyone that we have observed in regions like Bordeaux. For example, we spoke about Cabernet Franc, Cabernet Sauvignon. So Cabernet Sauvignon is a child of Cabernet Franc. Merlot is also a child of Cabernet Franc. And we blend them together and the result is fantastic. In a wine blend, the family team is always doing good. In Switzerland, we have a wine called Dole, which is a blend of Pinot and Gamay, father and child, and it's working well. My suggestion is when we identify parents and children, we can try to blend them in the glass. So that would be good to do. There is one producer in southern France, in Bergerac, Luc de Conti, Domaine de Conti, in Bergerac, who was telling me many years ago, we have Sauvignon Blanc, of course. We have Semillon, but I love Chenin Blanc. So I planted it, and I was the first one to plant it in southern France, in Bergerac. And I said, wow, that's good. And your wine is very good. But do you know that both of these guys, Sauvignon Blanc and Chenin Blanc, are the natural children of Savagnin? Oh, I didn't know that. Fascinating. A few years later, he came up to me with the wine, tasted. The wine was delicious. And he said, it's a blend. And the blend is thanks to you, because it's a blend of the parent and the two children. Blend of Savagnin planted in Bergerac, Sauvignon and Chenin Blanc. So he's one of the only ones to have listened to me, and the result is really fantastic. And also, as I said before, many people use the results that we have, me or my colleagues, regarding parentages, to tell stories to people, to their customers. And the more stories you can tell about a wine, the better you will sell it. So we help selling wines, and also all the work that we have done on obscure and old grape varieties, especially by releasing the book Wine Grapes. I think we played a small role in the resurrection of old varieties that were long forgotten. And we have raised maybe the awareness and the curiosity of the people and of the customers to taste something else than the regular 13 varieties that we find everywhere on the planet.
Yeah, I agree. That's really the biggest lift to the industry, is producers being able to tell better stories about what they're making and consumers understanding and getting excited about those stories as well. I think that is a huge driver. We see that already as a huge driver for getting people interested in wine. So I think that's great work.
Yeah, Brady, I would argue the biggest thing is saving those rare and going extinct varieties. My passion is the obscure things. I think that's why I first really wanted to speak with you, because I love the idea of an acre of a single variety left, and that we're finding it. It's good, and now that we're telling these stories, we're able to propagate it again. I think I was just traveling in Croatia, and on Korčula, they were so proud of the Gurk that they have, and they only have X amount of hectares of that. And you see that all throughout Croatia now. And it's like a point of pride, rather than some obscure variety from an island that they, don't grow that much of. So I think it's really cool.
Yeah. Whenever I travel, I try to promote the local varieties. For me, there is no point of going to Croatia and taste Merlot, for example. It can be good, but what is really exciting is the local varieties with their own taste and or their own organoleptic profiles. That is really exciting.
100%.
Thanks so much for sharing about your work, Jose, and
my pleasure.
Your writing, but also your work in the academy, both of which are super important. So I appreciate you coming on. I'll hopefully have you on again in the future, and best of luck and safe travels as you go around.
Thank you for having me. That was a pleasure.
Of course.
Thank you very much.
All right. That was our interview with José Vouillamoz. I hope everybody learned a lot about maybe the parents of Syrah, for example, or the parents of Sangiovese. Like Brady said before the interview, it was a lot, really packed with a lot of details. So go back, listen a couple times. I know I'm going to. And thank you for listening this week. We'll be back with another interview next week. Cheers.